The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Canavera. I am the co-director of the Care and Protection of Children, or CPC Learning Network, whose secretariat is housed at Columbia University in New York City. We are so excited to welcome you today to the fourth webinar in a joint series that the CPC Learning Network and Linea, the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation, and Abuse at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, have been organizing on social norms and violence reduction. The key themes of the series are social norms as they relate to the fields of gender-based violence, violence against children, sexual exploitation, and the abuse of children and adolescents. Before we get to the main event, our speaker, I'll just provide very brief background on the CPC Learning Network and Linea. The CPC Learning Network was established in 2005. We convene academics, policymakers, and practitioners to promote innovative research, nurture communities of learning, and to build the next generation of researchers and advocates for children and families around the world. We also, with the World Health Organization, co-chair the INSPIRE working group, which promotes evidence-based strategies to reduce violence against children. We're also delighted to be partnering with Linea, the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation, and Abuse, which is an international project exploring how social norm theory can be used to prevent sexual abuse and exploitation of children and adolescents globally. Centering adolescent girls, Linea aims to better understand and address the interdependence of human behavior and the structural realities that shape the individual experience of adolescent girls. Established in 2014, Linea is nested within the Gender, Violence, and Health Center at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Turning to today, the topic of today's webinar is how social norms can reflect and create social inequalities. And we are just delighted and so appreciative to have Stefanie Mollborn with us, who will be sharing on this topic. In terms of the flow of the webinar, I will soon turn it over to Stefanie for the presentation part, which will last about half an hour, and that will be followed by 20 minutes of Q&A, so we really hope to end in just about an hour. The question and answer function is already open. It is the little box that you see that says chat or questions. You can send your questions to us throughout the presentation, and we will then consolidate those and bring them to Stefanie at the end. To introduce Stefanie, Stefanie is a professor at the Institute of Behavioral Science and Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. She studies norms and social inequalities in the early life course. Her work focuses on the US context and combines statistical analyses of longitudinal population surveys with qualitative analyses of in-depth interviews. Dr. Mollborn received a PhD in sociology from Stanford University in 2006. Her 2017 book, Mixed Messages, Norms and Social Control Around Teen Sex and Pregnancy, is available from Oxford University Press. Stefanie's most recent mixed methods research continues a focus on social norms in the case of health lifestyles among children and teens, with a particular focus on technologies. So, very current and up to date, and I just can't wait to hear what we are going to learn from Stefanie. So Stefanie, over to you.
Hi everyone. I'm hoping that you can see my screen now. It looks like you can. I'm Steph, and because you don't have my talking head, here's a picture of me. I tend to be a very interactive and informal kind of speaker, so a webinar is a little bit my idea of a nightmare, but I'm just going to pretend that you're all there and we're interacting with each other. But to be serious, I really do welcome your questions and also your comments, as I'm talking about some things that are rooted in the particular cases that I study and the particular context of the US, and it'll be really interesting to see to what extent you find similarities or points of departure in what you're doing. I wanted to acknowledge some funders for this research, the National Science Foundation and my university, acknowledge my co-authors in the 2 different cases that I'm going to be discussing today, and then also the organizers of the webinar, both the CPC Learning Network and Linea, Lottie and Marie Celine at Linea, Nicholas and Mark at the CPC Learning Network, and then all of you who are taking the time at this busy and probably beautiful day of the summer for those of us on the Northern Hemisphere to be here listening to this and thinking about these really important issues. So to give you a brief overview of where I'm hoping to go in this half an hour or so, I want to talk about first the messiness of norms in real life. I know that a lot of you work in real life settings and know how messy norms can be. However, the scholarly research on norms often tends to be done in the lab and for good reasons wants to have it neat and tidy, but many of us know that it's not really that neat and tidy. And so just giving us some ideas, some examples to get as tools before we start thinking about social inequalities and norms. And so there I'll focus mainly on 2 things. One is how norms and social control get applied in differential ways. And then the other one is for the individuals who are the targets of the norms, how they have different capacities to either comply with the norms or to be able to evade the norms. Throughout most of the presentation, I'll be talking about the case that my book is about, which is norms about teen pregnancy and sexuality in the United States. But at the end, I'm going to try to sort of export this framework a little bit to talk about my current research topic of technology use among children and youth in the US. So as Mark was saying, this work is primarily based around my book, Mixed Messages, which came out from Oxford Press. The reason why I'm flashing this image is to give you sort of a caveat about how I think about what I'm doing. I think that we need to take actual concrete real life cases to be able to build theory about norms and to understand how they change, how social inequalities are involved. And so what I'm talking about is very much rooted in my cases. I'm not making any claims that it applies everywhere. And I think this is a great opportunity for a conversation for many of us from different parts of the world working on different kinds of issues to think through to what extent these things may or may not apply. So just to give you a little bit of background about my case, for those who aren't familiar, teen sexuality in the US is a really complicated issue. We're in this interesting situation where we have really quite strong norms against teen pregnancy and teen sexuality, and a lot of public conversation about those norms, a lot of stigma, at the same time that teens' behaviors don't conform to the norms very well. So compared to other developed countries, the US looks really typical in terms of the rates of teen sex and the ages at which teens start having sex, but we are considerably worse compared to many countries in terms of contraception rates, and especially in terms of pregnancy rates, abortion rates, and childbearing rates. And so there's this disjoint between norms and the behaviors that they're seeking to target, where the norms aren't particularly effective, which makes it really interesting to think about. But even within the US, we have a lot of differences. So this map shows you the teen birth rates. So this is the girls under age 20 who are having births. Almost all of these births are non-marital, and almost all of them are unintended. You can see that within the US, there's a 4-fold difference in the teen birth rate, depending on the state. And for people who are familiar with the US context, this map may make you think of a few things. For those who are unfamiliar, the things that this map tracks well with is it's a pretty good map of poverty in the US, where the states with higher teen birth rates also have higher levels of poverty. But very interestingly, it also is a pretty good map of a couple of other things. It maps strongly with conservative religion and conservative politics, but where the teen birth rates are higher in the more religious and more conservative states. This is interesting because the more religious and more conservative places tend to have stronger norms condemning teen sex and pregnancy, and yet those behaviors are more prevalent. And this is something that many people have pointed out. So social inequalities are really important in thinking about this case, but they're important in very complicated ways. Norms are, of course, interesting and complicated as well. Here we have an interesting etiquette book page from the 1950s that's laying out the rules for how you greet each other. But in reality, in real life, norms don't work that simply. We often have a hard time even identifying what the rules are. The rules may apply differently to different people. We may be able to see the norm when it's been violated by someone, but not be able to identify what the rules are otherwise until we see someone breaking them. This is another normative example. This is an ad that was placed in New York City a few years ago in an attempt to use social norms. It's called social norms marketing, and attempts to use social norms to change young women's behaviors. And so what you're seeing here is a little baby crying, presumably to his teen mom, saying, "I'm twice as likely not to graduate high school because you had me as a teen." Now, there are a few things I want to point out with this image. One is that this message contradicts a strong body of research, which suggests that it's the fact that this boy and his mom are socially disadvantaged that matters for his compromised future, not as much the age at which she ended up having him. It wouldn't matter very much whether she had waited 5 or 10 years to have a child. But the other thing that's interesting here is that this is an attempt to get girls to change their behavior on the basis of this ad, and it's not necessarily something that's likely to work, given that most teen pregnancies are unintended and girls aren't going into it wanting to do them. What is likely to work here, though, is stereotyping and stigma. And so, first of all, this is a young boy of color, and so it's reinforcing stereotypes about the kinds of girls who become teen moms, and therefore the kinds of girls that we as a society are supposed to be regulating. And also, it gives us implicit permission as a society to further stigmatize the girls who violate this norm. And so this is an ad that I would argue may be backfiring, in the sense that it can be further stigmatizing young women and therefore compromising the outcomes for them and their children without necessarily changing the behaviors of young girls, which was what the intent of the ad was. And so this is a really great example of how social inequalities can play into, be reflected in, and also be reinforced by norms if we don't think through what we're doing. And so I'll try to close with some thoughts about how we might act differently. So as all of us who are out in the real world know, norms are messy. So one of the ways that norms are messy is that we have multiple reference groups that may each hold different norms. So in the case of teen sexuality, the young people that I talked to, these were the social contexts they thought were important. They saw themselves as being embedded in a family that had one set of norms, but also embedded in peer groups that probably had different sets of norms. And those peer groups were within a school that was very important and had its own norms. And then all of that was embedded within a community. And so this made it really complicated and messy to understand what normative messages teens were giving, but also gave teens more opportunities to be able to choose which norms to adhere to. I'll talk about that in a little bit. There are also, norms tend to come in sets. So in the case of teen sexuality, we have a lot of different norms that are related to each other that people tend to think of as hanging together. And in this case, it's because there's a chain of related behaviors. And here I'll show you an illustration. So if you want to think about teen pregnancy, it starts with thinking about teen sex, whether teens engaging in sex, and there are strong norms regulating that. If they are, then contraceptive use is another really important point of behavior where there are strong norms. That can lead to pregnancy or not. And if there's a pregnancy, then there are these related outcomes of abortion or childbearing. And so understanding norms around teen pregnancy involves understanding the norms, the set of norms underlying all of these behaviors. And what we found in studying this is that people have what's called a rationale underlying this set of norms. So rationale is the reason why. Why should teens be behaving a certain way, the why of the norm. And so in the US, there are two rationales that are really prevalent depending on the person and the social context. One is a moral rationale, and it's rooted in religion often, and it's targeting particular the beginning and the end of the chain, sex and abortion. And it's saying that sex and abortion are morally wrong, and therefore teens should not be engaging in them. Other people subscribe to a practical rationale, which really focuses on the potential negative consequences of sexual behaviors for teens that could disrupt their lives. And there, often the focus is on sex, getting teens to avoid sex, or if they do have sex, the focus is on contraceptive use, trying to get them to contracept consistently so that the chain of behaviors is stopped there. And so this is how, in this case, I think about norms. They're coming in sets, different kinds of norms get focused on. And so This way of thinking about norms allows for conflict, for example, between the people who take a moral approach versus a practical approach to thinking about teen sex. That often comes into conflict. Thinking about change, as cultures change, as consequences change, the norms themselves can change, but also thinking about agency, where if there are so many reference groups and so many norms in a set, that gives people leeway to figure out how to behave, and they can adhere to some norms and not others. So all of this creates a lot of room for social inequalities in the way that I'm going to start to talk about now. What I want to point out before we talk explicitly about social inequalities is that people see this themselves. They see this messiness. So this is Claudia. She's a young woman who went to high school in the US. And she says, I think that sex is something that happens privately and pregnancy is something that happens publicly. So they kind of exist in different realms in our thoughts. Behavior really changes whether or not it's something that everyone's going to know or not. You could say, I wouldn't mind if one of my friends was pregnant. And you might respond totally differently because you'd have to deal with that in a more public setting. And I think that creates a situation where, as far as having sex, you could do what you wanted. But the pregnancy part, you'd probably do what your community would want. So what you can see here is that Claudia is thinking about these sets of norms. She can pull out different norms from the sets and be able to compare and contrast the private and the public implications of them, and to show that people's behavior and their way of reacting to people who violate the norm is contingent on which norm it is and how public it is. And towards the end of her quote, she's also pointing out that people have some agency, that as long as you keep it quiet, if it's just about having sex, you may be able to do what you want. You may be able to get away with it because of the privacy of the behavior, to behave in the way that you want without necessarily getting negative sanctions for having violated a norm. And so this is just pointing out that while this is messy to think about, those of us who live in these situations really do understand this messiness and can start to analyze it. So how does this all relate to social inequalities? A lot of us think about social inequalities and try to ameliorate them in our work. And often we see norms as a solution for trying to change behaviors in ways that are going to work better for people's lives. What's less common is thinking about norms as something that can potentially perpetuate problems around social inequalities. And so I would argue that both of those things are happening at the same time. I see, and from my case, I see a lot of struggle over the behavior of teenagers between the people who are seeking to control teens' behavior from the outside, and those people I call norm enforcers, right? So those might be parents, they might be teachers, they might be ministers or community members. And then the struggle on the other side is the teens themselves, who are seeking to exercise agency and make their own decisions. And so whoever ends up controlling the behavior of the teen, social scientists often see that control over behavior as an indicator of power. So we can think about this as a conflict or a struggle over power. If the teenager has internalized the norm enforcer's norms, then they'll want to behave in a way that does exactly what the norm enforcers want, and then we're not necessarily going to see a struggle. But when a teen becomes motivated to behave in a way that would violate a norm, we can see these struggles happening. And that's what I'm hoping to think about here in terms of social inequalities. So this is the key theoretical figure that I want to take a little bit of time on. It's from an unpublished paper with Cecilia Ridgway, but it lays out some of the ideas from the book. So remember, we were talking about norm enforcers and norm targets. So norm enforcers, let's just call those parents in this case, and then the norm target is the teen. And so when we have a situation where the parents want one thing and the teen wants another thing, then they can use different strategies to try to win out. So on the norm enforcers, the parents' side, they can try to communicate really clearly what their expectations are and what, if the teen violates those expectations, what kinds of negative sanctions they can expect. They can also try to limit the possibility that the teen can violate the norm, and I'll be showing you some examples of this in a minute. So simply make it less possible to violate the norm. They can, in a third strategy, they can try to manage the norm target's social relationships. So they can try to, say, cultivate the teen's friendships in a certain way, or their school in such a way that the people that they're exposed to are going to reinforce the same norm that the parents want to communicate. And that may keep the teen's behavior in line. The teen, on the other hand, may have counter strategies. They may try to minimize sanctions, for example, by keeping their behavior private or secret. They may help each other create opportunities to be able to violate norms, especially without people finding out, so that they would face sanctions. And I'll show you examples of that too. Teens may also seek social relationships that allow violation and that give them a different reference group with a different norm that they can conform to, so that not all their reference groups are saying don't have sex, for example. So we've got these strategies on the part of the parents, these counter strategies on the part of the teens. Who's going to win out? Who's going to end up controlling the behavior and even controlling the normative messages? Some of that is based on structural and cultural constraints. So if we look at the kinds of tools available to the different sides in this struggle, we can start to predict perhaps who's going to be able to have more control over the behavior. So one is just legal and physical control. So parents and schools, for example, can force teens to stay at home or to be at school at certain times. And so that's a good bit of control. Ability to monitor the targets. Can you see what is going on at any given moment? How much resource dependent do the targets have? In the US, teenagers are heavily resource dependent on their parents for pretty much every kind of thing that they need to spend money on, in most cases. And then finally, how observable is the behavior? And this is what Claudia was telling us. Sex is not particularly observable beyond the parties involved in most cases. But pregnancy, once it starts to show, that's a very observable behavior. And so that can affect who's going to be able to control behaviors. And then you've got cultural constraints. What kinds of reasons why you should behave in certain ways are considered acceptable in a certain culture? And metanorms is how people are expected to react to violators. So the more you're expected to punish violators, the more violators can expect everyone around them to punish them, the less control they're going to have over their behavior. And so we argue that these things together can help us understand who's going to control behavior and what the norms are going to be, whether they're going to be able to change. So what I'd like us to think about in this figure is social inequalities. So you can imagine social inequalities matter a lot for things like the social relationships that teens have and the options that they have, what friendships they can and can't build. Across social boundaries, teen friendships tend to be limited, for example. So if teens are from a stigmatized group, they may have fewer opportunities to be able to help each other violate norms. Things like the amount of resources that teenagers have can matter. Their social status can matter, the degree of control over their own lives they have. And so we can start to see how this plays out. And I'm going to give you a few more concrete examples coming up. So the first question is, who does social control target? How are there social inequalities in that? And I don't mean to be picking on her in any way, but this is a great example. This is a photograph of Bristol Palin, who is the daughter of a famous conservative politician, Sarah Palin, who ran for vice president for the Republican Party a couple of election cycles ago. And during that election cycle, it turned out that Bristol, who was a teenager, was pregnant and unmarried. And in her particular conservative religious social group, this would typically be considered a major problem. She would have been a major, highly visible norm violator. What happened was that there was a shift in the narrative to help people understand how what Bristol did was not necessarily to be stigmatized, but was something to be noble. And so the conversation shifted to, well, but look, she's refused to have an abortion, and this shows how strong her pro-life principles are, that she's living her principles, and therefore she's a moral young woman because she's choosing on behalf of her beliefs. And so this was an alternative narrative for something that would have normally have been strongly stigmatized. And because of Bristol's extremely high levels of social advantage, this narrative could be created and it got accepted by a lot of people. If Bristol had been a young woman of color, poor, living in the inner city, it's really unlikely that there would have been this chance for her to avoid some of the stigma that comes with becoming an unwed teen mother in the United States. And so there are ways in which we sort of, after the fact, justify people's behavior in ways that can fit with what we think that they should deserve. And that means that there's going to be really different levels of judgment, potentially, depending on who a young woman is. Here is an example of a young man who came from a community much like Bristol Palin's, a conservative, religious, primarily white, primarily high social class community. And in this community, the kids are considered the kinds of folks who are not the problem with regard to teen sex and pregnancy. Their parents don't see them as the kind of people who need to be stigmatized. And so what's happening is the parents in the community are trying to enforce the norms in ways that are going to not lead to stigma for the teens. So instead, they're just trying to remove opportunities for violation. So he talks about not being put in situations where sex was possible, not being given cars, or not being given opportunities to have a bed, that parents would say, boys and girls can come over, but you have to leave the door open in your room. And so parents were trying to avoid a situation in which the teens could violate the norms and be stigmatized. And this was really standard for socially advantaged teens. In high schools, we can see a lot of the same dynamics. High schools that were composed of the kind of teens that stereotypically are seen as typical teen parents, often all of the teens were treated in such a way that they might be considered to be teen parents already. But in the more advantaged high schools, the teen parents were pulled out because they didn't fit with the reputation of the school. And so Dylan talked about this alternative center, that a girl would be pulled out of the high school and put into the alternative center. Now, it would be against the law for a public school to force her, but they would have been encouraged. And he said, so you wouldn't know anyone in our school ever got pregnant. And Adrian, in a similar school, said that there was a totally different program elsewhere in the district that girls got transferred to in order to uphold the reputation that our students don't get pregnant. And so you can see in these socially advantaged contexts, teen pregnancy is strongly avoided, strongly pushed away and sort of made invisible, but in ways that are not necessarily stigmatizing the advantaged kids. And it's very different in less advantaged contexts. So among the people who are the norm targets, who complies with the norms and who evades the norms? Social inequalities really play in here a lot too, to see how much teens are able to enact the strategies that they want to enact. They may, if they have lots of opportunities for friendship in their community, they may be able to build social relationships that help them get what they want in terms of their behaviors, that help them avoid sanctions. Or if they're from a more stigmatized and marginalized group, they may not have those options. And in fact, regardless of how they've behaved, people may already just go ahead and assume that they've violated the norms and stigmatize them anyway. So what we see happening in my data are, for example, that teens who have this opportunity to build strong social relationships and who aren't stigmatized, they can help each other find safe occasions for sex where they'll be able to have sex without people finding out and without getting stigmatized. They will contracept very carefully in order to avoid pregnancy, which is really the more visible behavior. This, of course, contraception in the United States, especially before the Affordable Care Act, is something that to do without your parents finding out is quite expensive. And so teens would need to have a good bit of financial resources or wherewithal about clinics to be able to find this option. Reserving sex for committed romantic relationships, where both parties in the sexual relationship are equally committed to making sure that people don't find out and therefore don't gossip. This is another strategy teens do. Avoiding public talk about sexual behavior. This is a lot easier if you're the kind of teen that people think is not the problem in terms of pregnancy and not likely to get pregnant, even though teens from all across different social spectrums end up pregnant in the United States. And then this often works in the opposite direction. So what I've talked about up until now is situations where teens are having sex, but they're leading people to believe that they aren't. For disadvantaged and stigmatized teens, it very often works in the opposite way, that they may not be having sex, but everyone goes ahead and assumes that they are, and maybe even that they've been pregnant. This is especially true for girls. And so if they're the kind of teen that's stereotyped to be sexually active and having pregnancies, then people may go ahead and treat them in that way. For example, teachers not giving them the opportunity to excel academically because they assume that they're going to get pregnant and drop out of school. And so the public talk and the private behavior, there's a really strong disjoint there, and that disjoint gives teens a lot of agency, but it also allows social inequalities to play out and get reinforced, to where the disjoint means that you get sort of damned without trial and jury based on your social characteristics and what people think may be typical for you rather than on your actual behaviors. So what are the implications of all this for norm change based in this particular case? I want to just draw out a handful of things. The first is that it's very useful to bring norms out into the open. If we talk about what the norms actually are, if we name the rules, then we can start to have conversations about whether we think those should be the rules and what we think the consequences of those rules are, intended or not. Amy Shalit, who's a sociologist who studies the Netherlands and the United States, has written a wonderful book called Not Under My Roof that talks about the conversation that happened in the Netherlands, especially in the 1970s, around whether their highly conservative messages around teen sex and pregnancy were having the consequences that the society was hoping. And those norms changed quite rapidly on the basis of that conversation, is what Shalit argues. And so if you bring the norms out into the open and you can start to have conversations about them at many levels, that can facilitate norm change and deliberate norm change that we've thought through the consequences of. We should consider which norms in a set to target for change, because some may be more amenable to change than others. For example, in the US, it would not be particularly productive to try to take on the abortion debate when getting different political sides to agree on how to tackle teen pregnancy, because that's perhaps the most contentious part of that chain of behaviors. On the other hand, agreeing around teen contraception might be easier, because there is strong agreement that teen pregnancy is an unwelcome consequence, and that could be prevented through certain kinds of contraception. And so that might be an easier norm in the set to target for change. We need to remember that just strengthening norms without having these kinds of considered conversations may simply strengthen social inequalities, and just, rather than changing behaviors, just strengthens stigma and increased differences between stigmatized groups and others. So that billboard that I showed you from New York City is a great example of that it may not be changing teen girls' behaviors, but it likely is strengthening social inequalities and the condemnation of teen mothers and young girls who are stereotyped to be the typical groups for teen mothers. And so keeping this in mind is really useful, so that we don't go and blindly just seek to strengthen norms without thinking through the social inequalities that they're linked to. Empowering individuals and communities can be really useful, because that can empower them both to behave in the ways that they see as being motivated by, but also empowering them to really talk through and think through and try to change their norms, instead of needing to blindly follow normative pressures in an unquestioning way. Analyzing the structures is important. Of course, as a sociologist, I have to say this, right? But for example, the ways that the high schools that we talked about were strongly disadvantaging girls who became pregnant. That's something that may or may not actually work in terms of discouraging teen pregnancy, but it certainly is creating negative consequences for the lives of the girls involved. And so really thinking through these structures and policies and what their consequences are is important. It's particularly important to think through these structures, what might be motivating norm targets, and what alternatives there are or aren't available to them. This is particularly important because that is a key for policy. And we tend to think that norm changes create new policies, but much social science research shows us that it often goes the other way around, that if we change the policies, the norms will follow. And so part of what I think we need to think through is, let's not be afraid to change some policies. The norms can come after. Two examples in the United States are a sexual harassment policy. There was not much public concern about sexual harassment, but after corporations became legally liable for sexual harassers in their midst, they created policies against sexual harassment and trainings that then changed people's norms and attitudes, and people began to see sexual harassment as a problem. Another example is the racial integration of the US Armed Forces, where public opinion was not in favor of integrating the armed forces, but the military went ahead and did it. And then after that happened, then public opinion changed to be strongly in favor of racial integration. And so thinking about norms as not necessarily, it's a chicken and an egg problem, right? We don't necessarily need to see them as the cause of things, but starting to see them as the effect of things is important as well. And so thinking about norms, structures, policies all together can be a fruitful path, I think. So really briefly, in the 5 minutes or so I have left, I want to talk a little bit about the research topic that I'm working on at the moment, which is technology use among children and teens in the US. Technology use is really interesting, as probably all of us know, in part because it's changing so quickly. Parents are having a hard time keeping up with what the information is about what's good and what's bad, about what people are typically doing, about what the technologies even are. Parents often lack basic knowledge compared to their kids who are maybe out ahead of them. Parents see strong pros and cons to technology. So on the one hand, they see it as problematic because they think it's addictive. They think it's taking their kids' time away from other productive things like physical activity or building face-to-face relationships. On the other hand, though, they could become the next Bill Gates. If they become technologically savvy, there's a lot of skills that are very marketable for careers there. And so parents don't really know what the right way to go is. And this creates a fascinating normative case study to see how norms form and how they change. And that's what I've been focusing on here, also using qualitative data. So what we're finding is that norms are very much in flux. Parents don't know what the rules are. When we invite parents to engage in focus group interviews together with other parents from the community, they immediately start talking to each other about technology. And what are you doing? What rules do you have? What do you think about this? Did you read that book? They're trying to figure out what the norms are. What we do know is the norms are being unintentionally shaped by policies. In the two communities that we've studied, each community's school district introduced a technology policy without much input from parents. In one case, it was laptops, and in one case, it was iPads that they gave to children, and all of their homework is to be done on these devices. And so they have the devices at home, and the real kicker from the parents' point of view is that if they ever ask their kid to stop using the technology, the kid can always answer, "But I'm doing my homework." And so the parents saw this as a deliberate intrusion on the part of the school district into their homes, forcing technology into their homes where they might not have wanted to have it. The school district, this was an unintended consequence for. They were simply seeing what could be good during the school day for their instruction and what would be a good platform for turning in and grading homework. And so the policies really matter for the norms here and the conflicts. Parents, as I said, are really seeking advice from each other, and they're wanting to know what the norms are very explicitly. Parents are attempting to socially control their kids with regards to technology, but that control tends to be ineffective and inconsistent. So they might, for example, set a kitchen timer that a kid can have 20 minutes, but then they find out that the kid snuck away with their mom's phone and were playing games down in the basement and they had no idea. So the fact that this behavior cannot be easily monitored is something that matters for the growth of the norms. The parents don't necessarily have enough knowledge about what the kids are doing or about how the kids can be hiding what they're actually doing. And so it's increasing kids' agency because like the teens who are having sex without people knowing, the kids are going into places where they're able to use the technology without their parents knowing what they're doing. And I was the test case for my qualitative research team. I had a kid in the right age group, and it was very interesting to look at the field notes and see how much my own child was getting away with technology use that I was not aware of. There are a lot of inaccurate assumptions about social inequalities that are playing out in terms of technology use in this particular time and place. Lots of stereotypes about how less socially advantaged kids, well, their parents don't care as much, or they're not monitored as much because their parents don't have as much time, or they all have gaming consoles, they all have phones. We used nationally representative statistical data and found actually that the exact opposite is true, that the kids who have the most highly educated parents are the ones who they have the most devices, they're using technology the most, and they're even video gaming the most. And so because we don't have correct knowledge about how the social inequalities are playing out, these stereotypes are likely allowing the kids who actually are the problem in terms of high levels of tech use, the socially advantaged kids, allowing their parents to believe that it's not as big of a problem for them to need to deal with, which is inaccurate information. And so in this situation where everything's in flux and everything's changing, those of us who are interested in norms-based interventions, this is a great example of something that could have a major impact. And I looked through my data to see, well, what's a real-life example of something that's having a really good impact? And I found one example that I wanted to share with you, and it came from several parents. It was a particular Montessori school that's a public school, and it had a principal with a really clear vision of what kind of technology use the kids should be having. And the principal brought the school's technology use in line with that normative vision, communicated that normative vision very clearly to the families, and made it work in a way that the parents thought was very functional. And they were really the only happy parents in our sample around their kids' technology use. So we had several parents, but I'll let Sharon do the talking here. So she talks about this Montessori school. They get one computer for the whole classroom that they use sometimes for research, but they don't do stuff on screens, which I love. He does have an email account. He doesn't have a cell phone, and he wants one, but he knows it's okay. None of his friends have them, so that's really good. In the Montessori school, they say they really get through that 6th year of development. So he's a 12-year-old in the 6th grade. Get through that year without the phone, and you're going to be so much better off. Wait as long as you can, but at least through that 6th year. And so what's going on successfully in this particular case is there are clear normative messages being communicated. The kids' entire friendship groups and social networks are behaving in the same ways, and it's the same way that the parents are on board with and the school is on board with. So all of these reference groups are lined up. And the message is really clear that there's nothing wrong with a phone when you're older, but not right now. Wait until you're older. And that message seems to be working pretty clearly for kids. And so you do see he asks for a phone, and pretty much all the kids did, but there's not as much pushback as we saw in other contexts where there wasn't that shared understanding in the community about when it's appropriate to get a phone. And so this to me seems like a really positive example of a kind of intervention. In this case, it sounded like it was being done pretty much single-handedly in a way that was becoming very effective and very appreciated. So it's interesting to end on a positive note instead of talking about all the things that we do wrong with norm-based interventions. How can we think about what goes right? And so leaving you with this really concrete case, I'm doing this on purpose because I would love to hear about the particular concrete cases in which you're working and your thoughts about how norm change happens and how social inequalities play into that. So I thank you for listening, and I love to hear your thoughts. You can see my email address here, and I'm very happy to chat with anyone. Also, my webpage is here if you want to look up anything more about my research. And with that, I will turn things over to the question and answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stefanie. Absolutely fascinating examples there. I really appreciated your starting with theory as being rooted in empirical evidence and case studies, because if these two things are disconnected, then it's often hard to make the connection between them. And I also really appreciated the complexity of norms as coming together in groups or sets, as you mentioned. We do have two initial questions. One is from Tirza Brown. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Is the teen birth rate higher in states with more conservative religious cultures related at all to fewer abortions in those states? I think I understand the question, and if you don't, maybe we can go back to Tirza and ask for some clarifications. And also a question here about norm enforcers, and I think this may be linked to Tirza's question. You know, can the norm enforcers go beyond the level of individuals acting as norm enforcers? So, for example, can a broader cultural belief serve as a norm enforcer, or what are the various mechanisms that those come through? So to others, please don't hesitate to send questions in while Stefanie's responding to those first two.
Great, thank you. On the first question, which was about whether the abortion rates are lower in states that are more politically conservative, that have those higher teen birth rates. Darn it, you got me. I thought I had looked at all of the different combinations, but I do not know the answer to that one. What I can say in the US in general is that we have both very high teen pregnancy rates and teen birth rates and unusually high teen abortion rates. Whether those abortion rates track with conservative places is tricky, and I think the main reason why that's tricky is because I think it's the high 80% of US counties don't have access to an abortion provider, and that is very much linked to political conservatism. And so I don't know that we would have the data to be able to track that very well. So the abortions tend to be happening in larger places, which also tend to be more politically liberal, regardless of where someone's coming from. And so I haven't necessarily seen the data about the actual residential location of the people getting the abortions. It's a fascinating question, and I hope that somewhere the data is out there to answer it. The second question was about norm enforcers and cultural beliefs and how they relate to each other. In the way that I think about it, I see norm enforcers as either people or groups, and cultural beliefs or rationales, things like that, as the tools that they can use to help them achieve their goals, which is usually controlling the norm target's behavior. And so the cultural beliefs themselves aren't necessarily doing that controlling, right? It's people in groups who are doing that controlling, but the cultural beliefs can be an extremely strong tool. So, for example, in communities where there is strong shared agreement about religious norms, then the idea that a particular behavior is immoral can be something very strong and powerful to help control teenagers' behaviors because people agree with that. But the more lack of consensus you have, some of my quantitative research has shown that when you have less consensus, then you don't necessarily have as much behavior adhering to the norm, because once you have somebody coming in questioning that, then you have this opportunity to choose a different reference group, to choose a different norm. And so it's not just the strength of the cultural beliefs, but also the level of consensus around cultural beliefs in a particular place that can start to drive the ability of norm enforcers to control norm targets' behaviors.
Very, very interesting. And some more questions, Stefanie. Some of these are from me and others have come in from others. First of all, you know, you ended on this very interesting case study about the technology use in that specific school. And I'm also recalling that France has just outlawed, and I don't know the specifics of the law, but I know that smartphones are no longer allowed in French schools. So I'm just wondering, is there empirical evidence about the use of technology in children and when that should be, and how does, you know, with teen pregnancy, it's quite obvious that, you know, the later in life a child has, or a teenager has a child, you know, the better, and that the life outcomes will be better. But is there empirical evidence that also drives some of these norms about what appropriate ages for various levels of technology use are? Another question that's just come in from Kathleen Cuillar is, what do you think about trying to change norms and creating guilt? For example, insisting on the importance of breastfeeding and then mothers feeling guilty if they don't succeed, which is a very interesting question. And a third one is around broad entertainment initiatives like Teen Moms. That was a television show created to demonstrate the complexity of what life as a teenage mother looked like. But quite ironically, the girls in it became stars for teenagers and and became celebrities. So obviously you can't control the way things the way things turn out, but I think both questions 2 and 3 are about unintended consequences of public campaigns to change social norms. Thoughts on those, Stefanie?
Oh, these are great questions. The first one about the evidence of, you know, at what age is it appropriate for kids? The evidence is lagging so strongly. First of all, because the technologies are changing so quickly, the research enterprise tends to go more slowly than that. But second of all, it's a common problem with any kind of media research that it's really hard to randomize, right? So, for example, do video games make kids more violent? Well, we would really need a randomized controlled trial exposing some kids to video games and others not to. And we've never, even though video games have been around for decades, we've never really been able to, in a satisfactory way, answer that question. And so there really isn't very much evidence. And it seems clear that parents understand that there isn't really much evidence and that they're going to have to wing it because the evidence won't be there in time for this cohort of children, which is really interesting. At the same time, by the way, that these parents talk about how they watch TV all the time as kids. And back in that day, you know, kids' heavy levels of TV watching were a major social problem. But this cohort of parents sees their heavy levels of TV watching as children as something that was just absolutely insignificant and didn't matter for them. And so it's very interesting. And then there were these 2 questions really about unintended consequences of normative messages. And I totally find this fascinating as well. If we try to change norms, do we increase levels of guilt? And the example given was breastfeeding. That is a fabulous example, right? And I think it also applies to some extent to my case, where you've got most teen births being unintended. So you've got a situation both with teen births and with breastfeeding where people don't know if they're going to end up being in that stigmatized group. And so therefore, we may just be creating guilt around something that we're assuming is an intended behavior that can be controlled, when in fact, it's not something that people necessarily are controlling. And so if we do change the norms around breastfeeding to the extent that young women who have children and don't breastfeed are feeling stigmatized, then that's again creating a problem. And so this is, I think you're pointing out a wonderful example of why we need to be careful with norms-based marketing in order to target behaviors, and instead look at structures, look at workplace laws, parental leaves, ways in which breastfeeding is not being made possible for people, so that then if you are someone who is able to or unable to, you have the structures in place to facilitate it, but you're not using norms to try to stigmatize people who don't do it. And with the reality shows, I think it's a similar thing, right? To some extent, it was a bit of a norms-based marketing effort. But I know from talking to many people in anecdotal conversations that they believe the reality shows instead glamorize the teen moms. There was one influential study that they thought had found that watching these shows reduced levels of teen pregnancy in the markets where they were shown, but that, to my understanding, that research has been called seriously into question. So I don't think we really have good research evidence of it. But I do think that the more we try to manipulate norms without really thinking through the larger structures and policies and incentives and motivations, the more we can end up with these potentially problematic unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think hearing you describe the way that we should not be approaching, in the example of teen pregnancy, teenagers as a monolith, when I think about the very successful marketing around smoking cessation to teenagers, they really had to drill in when the broad campaigns hadn't worked. Who were these pockets of teens who were still smoking? And they had to really craft very clever messages around quitting smoking as kind of sticking it to the man of the tobacco industry. And the way that they did extremely sophisticated market research, well beyond what we in academia tend to do. I kind of looked at this research and thought, wow, they really kind of knew how to dig into this little group here. And so I think we have to be very careful with all of this. Two last questions, and then I think we'll wrap up. From Bijetri Bose, and apologies if I have mispronounced your name, Bijetri. You gave two great examples of policies affecting norms. There are also examples of norms affecting policy changes, like same-sex marriage. Are there patterns in the kinds of norms that develop before they influence policies? And then a last question is around norms for adolescent boys and girls around teen pregnancy, and you gave examples of schools and girls having to leave school when they become pregnant. And this is an area where I think that consequence does not necessarily play out for boys in the same way. And so to what extent are all of these analyses gendered?
Yeah. Those are great questions. So the first question about norms shaping policies, absolutely, I think you're right. And if we do take the case of gay marriage, I think it's a really interesting case, right? Because I think it's often more complicated than that, and there's a feedback loop. And so we can see with the public opinion data, to the extent that that is sort of reflecting norms, the public opinion was changing, just tipping over towards favorability, and then the Supreme Court weighed in, and then it sort of escalated. The people in favor of gay marriage, it took off after the policy. And so it was both before and after the policy. And I think that's often really pretty typical, right? So sexual harassment policy, that did come at a time when attention to gender inequality was happening. And so it wasn't like the policy came out of nowhere. And so I think that you're absolutely right in acknowledging that complexity. And so I think this is not my research area, but my understanding is that people who study this would say that it is in many ways a feedback loop, but that we often think about norms shaping policies more than we think about policies shaping norms. The second question is about teen boys and how much of this is gendered. And oh yes, oh my goodness, it is so gendered. We would ask young people about the teen parents they knew in their community or their school, they would inevitably mention several girls, several of whom were from disadvantaged social groups, and it wasn't even clear whether they knew for sure that they had become teen moms. There were just rumors. So this was another case of social disadvantage coming out of these normative processes. But they would essentially never mention boys. And so when we would ask about it, once they got to a couple of concrete cases of young mothers, we would say, so who was the father? And they not only often didn't know, but they looked at us like, why is that relevant? And so gender is so deeply embedded in these processes, and the stigma is so deeply embedded for girls. But I think that what I did find, though, is that boys do hear the same normative messages as girls. This might have not been true in generations past, but this is what we're hearing in very different kinds of communities, like different social class, different religious contexts. Boys and girls are being given similar messages, but girls are the ones who are facing the consequences if they violate the norm. And so it is heavily gendered.
Yeah. And then in terms of, just to follow on to that, and I realize we have just 3 or 4 minutes left here. Is there research or learning around the ways in which those messages can or should be tailored to boys and girls differently? Or is it better to have a common approach?
Well, what I can talk to you about is, again, Amy Shalet's research on the Netherlands, which the book Not Under My Roof is really lovely. She talks about the way that norms are communicated in modern day Netherlands, which for the parents she talked to a few years ago was very, very different from the way they had grown up in a conservative Catholic country where sex was very heavily discouraged and quite gendered. Now, the messages that parents are trying to give have to do with, for boys and for girls, you shouldn't have sex until you feel ready, until you are in a loving and committed relationship, until you are ready to use effective contraception, and until you are ready not to let it derail your life. And by that, they typically mean their relationships with family members and also their school performance. And so the ways that parents are taking, so these norms are just as strong as in the US, right? The norms about parents regulating teens' sexual activity, but they deal with it in such different ways through sleepovers in the home. So the boyfriend, the girlfriend gets to sleep over, and this is true regardless of the gender of the teen. And because the sleepovers are happening in the home and the relationship is happening under the eye of the parents, they're able to give a lot more explicit communication, a lot more explicit control over contraception. And this seems to be less gendered in the way that she's analyzing these data. It seems to be something that's like a less gendered message. So both boys and girls are supposed to be making sure that these conditions are being met if they decide to engage in sex.
Absolutely fascinating and very complex. Thank you for unpacking a lot of that complexity for us here. And I realize what a very, how much more there would be to learn on this. I want to thank everyone who joined us today and give a big thank you to you, Stefanie. We will share the presentations and a video of this recording with everybody who participated, as well as those who registered but weren't able to join us today. And then it will just be available for public viewing as well. So we hope that many more people will see it that way as well. And we hope that this is a nice, different kind of format for people to learn about your important work who may not, have the time or perhaps the inclination to read research reports. So thank you for consolidating this all into something that was digestible but quite complex. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your help, and I appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day or evening, depending on where you are in the world.